Dave March, and welcome to Land of Confusion, the Ricochet show for members by members. And here's my co-host, Don.
Hi, Don Tillman. I'm the Ed McMahon part of the show, I could say. Yes.
I thought I was more like the guy who's running I'm the Blue Yeti of this program, I feel sometimes. And here we're today speaking to Gary Mcvey, one of the many members, and sometimes I believe you're an official contributor to the site as well, or moderator.
Oh, yes, I'm a very official. Yeah,
Okay,
anyway, I became a contributor last year. I've been a Ricochet member for 10 years, since May 2010.
Cool. So we'll get into the questions so we can get to know you better. So, I went to the wrong screen here. So where were you born and where did you grow up?
New York City is the answer to both questions. My family's from the South Bronx, which is a pretty rough area. I'm a libertarian. I was a Nixon fan when I was kind of unusual because I was about the only Catholic at that time.
We were just recently talking about how you realized you were not like the other kids around in California.
Well, actually, I first started out by not being like the other kids in New York. And the main thing that was unusual is that I was for Nixon because everybody else thought I should be for Kennedy because I was Irish and Catholic. That to me seemed un-American. I didn't like being told that I had to be for Kennedy. Also, I didn't think Kennedy knew how to comb his hair. I mean, I was 8 years old. Stuff like that really counts. So I was for Nixon. I'm still for Nixon. I'm a Nixon man.
Yep. Yep, I agree. I'm very. There's a few things that he did, I understand, in order to get reelected or get more votes in that election, and so the price controls are a thing that I understand why he did it, but don't exactly think that was for the best of everybody that he did do that. But on the foreign policy side, he cleaned up a lot of problems. He solved Vietnam, and he got the Chinese on board and all these other things. So I'm very happy for that from Nixon.
I've always taken my moral standing from leaders, from heroes, like a soldier, a statesman, a man of God. So a soldier like Sergeant Bilko, a statesman like Richard Nixon, a man of God like Cardinal Richelieu.
Well, very good.
Huge Bilko fan.
I'm a bit of a Richelieu fan.
That was a great show.
Yeah, that was terrific. And the funny thing is, much of that timing came from vaudeville. You could hear Jewish Second Avenue comedy theater in the routines. Like the way they'd stretch things out, they'd say something like, "All right, Bilko, take your 3-day pass and go to Las Vegas." And immediately, Bilko wouldn't even take that. He'd be working to expand it. Say, "Oh, the Colonel couldn't make that for 3 days. Could you, Colonel, sir? If you could make it for like 5 days, sir." Bilko, cut that out. The Colonel's wife, she was a child bride, you say? So there's a lot to learn from Ernie Bilko, no question.
Yeah, I love that.
And there's a lot to learn from Richard Nixon.
Yeah. Didn't you do the voice for Top Cat or something like that? Was it?
That's Dawes Butler.
Okay.
Yeah, no, he. I think I know who you're talking about. Maurice Gosfeld played Doberman. He did the voice of Benny the Ball.
That's it. Okay. Here we go for some Hanna-Barbera trivia now. That's great.
Well, growing up in Canada, what happened is in Toronto, it's called Toronto, Canada's Wonderland. And for some reason, they got Hanna-Barbera was the big cartoon people who made Canada's Wonderland. So when I went there as a kid, they had like the Smurf Village, they had all of the Flintstone Town, you had all these things you could go and deal with from Hanna-Barbera out there. Now they're all gone after they got sold off to the Cartoon Network. So Canada's Wonderland is a very different place. But when I was a kid growing up, I could do all the Hanna-Barbera stuff there versus Americans getting to go to see Disney.
Yeah, no, I was a big Jetsons fan for a while when I was a kid. The show came out when I was 11 years old, That, by the way, that was the very first color show that the ABC television network ever had.
Oh.
ABC was perpetual number 3. They are a perpetual loser compared to the other two, because at the time, America basically had enough advertising to support about 2.5 TV networks. So ABC became the half network. And they had no money for color, which was very, very expensive for broadcasters to put in. So they put in a cartoon. That was it. They didn't need any color TV cameras. All they needed to do was run a color cartoon on a projector, and suddenly, boom, they're a color network.
And they were the first, right? The first to broadcast in color?
Now that would be NBC.
Yeah, that seems more likely to me.
That's how come they're still proud as a peacock, as they say. That's what the peacock refers to, is color television.
Yeah.
NBC in color. I remember
That's
that
it.
in the old Star Treks. Desilu was running it.
I know you guys are answering the questions, but I have to make an observation, which is Don has always surprised me with the stuff he knows about music that no conservative supposedly would know. You know, it's like, oh, well, that thing of Frank Zappa's, well, you know, he was using a ring modulator, you know, with a square wave and that. And it's like, where the hell did you get that? Because honestly, I did not come to Ricochet expecting to be outclassed by experts in this field.
Okay. Well, when I was really, really young, I developed just a passion, just a total passion for electronics and computers and music all at the same time. And I just consider them the same. And it was the same year the Beatles dropped Sgt. Pepper, and everything was changing, and everything, new genres of music being created. Technology was changing. Black and white was going color. Mono was going stereo. We're going from vacuum tubes to transistors, to integrated circuits, and holy crap, we're on the moon, right? And that's crazy, and that affected me. And I've always been into the way popular music became more and more sophisticated over the years. We had this wonderful combination, synergy of things going on. The technology of the instruments, the technology of the recordings, and the technology of the playback were all growing. We're all being, improving and accelerating about the same time. And the musicians were learning, were applying more sophisticated musical forms, and the listeners were getting more sophisticated all at the same time. So I fell in love with this kind of progressive rock, and then jazz and Baroque music and everything all mixed together. To me, it's all one, again, Zappa, he referred to it as one big note. So yeah, I know all I live for all the subtleties and details in the hardware and all the way it was done and the way it was assembled. Nothing's more fun than that for me.
Or for the rest of us, or many of the rest of us anyway.
Oh, of course.
Oh, so for instance, it's the topic here.
Oh, no problem.
Just got a new, here we go. Where's the camera? There we go.
Oh, excellent.
It's a 5Y3, I think it is. Yeah, 5Y3. The
Damn, I should have prepared for this. I have all kinds of obsolete stuff I could have dragged down on camera. And actually,
no, this is actually important. This is important right now because this vacuum tube in my guitar amp over there blew up, and so I had to get a replacement.
Well, it's nice to know that analog devices still have a use, still have a function in today's world.
Well, guitar amps still, some large fraction, like over 50% of the serious guitar amplifiers are all vacuum tubes, and some hi-fi gear, and of course some radio and X-ray stuff, and microwaves.
Yeah, I remember hearing a story a few years ago about how the DEW line, this nuclear defense line of radar stations in northern Canada, was they could only get their tubes for their satellite, or sort of for their radars from Soviet Union at the time, because they were the only place in the left in the world that was building the type of large scale doohickeys, I guess, there.
Right.
The tubes, and they had to get them from Soviet Union, and they're like, had to come up with reasons to tell the Soviets why they needed these tubes to still, because they didn't want to admit that the only reason they could have their entire network of stations go down because the Soviets would hold out on them.
Absolutely true. And so yeah, at some point, the major tube manufacturers in the U.S., like RCA and such, Mallard, went out of that business, and then most of the European ones, I think Philips and some others, went out of business. And so this particular one is a
There we go.
brand. I mean, it's reversed for me, but I think it should be right for you. It's a Russian that's now owned by a guitar amp manufacturer, but it's a Russian made. Yeah, and yeah, they were. Yes, it's an advantage to a country when you invent the transistor, right?
It's true, but on the other hand, Russia invented the picture tube, the television picture tube, in 1907.
Oh, I didn't know
Really?
that. They did the first picture tube.
They had the first picture tube, but they didn't have the first camera. So they had basically
And much to watch.
Yeah, no, there was nothing much on TV in 1907. But
Yep.
but the irony is that towards the end of the Cold War, in the second half of the 80s, the Russians no longer made sensitive color cameras, miniature color cameras for espionage work. So they sent people to Frankfurt Airport, and they just bought them right off the shelf of the electronics store there, Sony.
Mm-hmm.
And I would make some sort of little snide joke about it, except at the time we were no longer making that stuff either. So we bought it from Sony just like they did.
Right, right.
So they were supplying both the KGB and the CIA.
What's that joke from a very bad James Bond movie? Like, you want to give James Bond it was a View to a Kill. The best thing about that is the theme song. That's about it. But but at the end of the movie, the Soviets want to give James Bond, the hero of the Soviet Union, medal.
Oh,
like,
yeah,
why
yeah,
do you want
that's
to give
right.
him that? It's like, well, we also need to get all our stuff from Silicon Valley too.
That's right. Yeah, no, I remember that. It's like, I should think you would have been happier if Silicon Valley had been destroyed. And General Gogol says, but where would Russian research be without it?
Yep.
Yeah, by the way, I like the palace at Versailles, whatever that is. Man,
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I just found it on the internet.
It's his den.
I had that search from 72 show poster, but it was so dark I couldn't see anything. So I was like, I got to get the palace out. That's even things out.
Yeah, the Search TV show had a thing. The spy was, typically handsome young guy, and he had a camera and some sort of microphone implanted in his head. So essentially everywhere he went, back in the big control room on giant screens, they could see what he was doing and tell him what to do. Okay, make a left, go down the hallway, whatever. It's sort of like Max Headroom before its time.
Yeah. But now we get to do that with these things.
Yeah.
Does it all for us.
Yeah, I think people in the 1930s would have been startled to find out that once these all-seeing, all-hearing cameras were installed in people's homes, it would be done at people's own expense, willingly.
Mm-hmm.
Something like Alexa would have seemed like dystopian science fiction 50 years ago. But hey, now we pay for it.
Yep. But on the other hand, we also now know that you have to have impossibly powerful algorithms, and the algorithms to scan all that data that's flowing through, and they still don't know how to find the terrorists, let alone try to go against us. We're little people.
Well,
so that sort of brings up, or the previous thing brings up, one of my favorite posts of yours, Gary, the one on color television.
Ah, yes.
That was one of my favorites. I'm reminded how good that was. And
you're very kind, very kind. It's always been an interest of mine. I think because we were too color television, developed an outsized interest in it until that wonderful day in 1963 when one of my father's Teamster friends got us a TV that fell off the back of the truck.
Mm.
It sort of landed on the serial numbers and obscured them somewhat.
That happens,
Yeah, no, I mean, you leave the back door open and bam, 20 sets fall out on the street. It's horrible, terrible. At the time, also, it was still rare in 1963 to get color, especially in our neighborhood, which, frankly, was not the richest in the universe.
Mhm.
And I was able to see, for example, the very first Mets game at Shea Stadium, as opposed to the old Polo Grounds, was in color. So it was kind of amazing in April of '64 to turn it on and say, because Shea was only, a couple of miles, it just looked so perfect. It looked like the cleanest, most modern baseball stadium in the universe, which, for about a week, it probably was. And yeah, I remember those days. It was very difficult to keep a color set running because it was all tubes, as you demonstrated. Vacuum tubes are lovely, but for television applications, solid state was more reliable. So what often happened, I'm sure, actually you guys are probably not old enough to remember this, but we used to take the tubes out of the sets ourselves and take them down to the drugstore where they had a little testing machine. You could put in and test your own tubes, and if one was bad, they had a whole bunch of, substitutes you bought. So you could basically fix your own color TV, which was kind of amazing at the time. It's also kind of amazing legally. You would never see that today, because the idea of telling your customers to stick your hand in the back of the set with the back taken off would probably make the lawyers faint.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely true. Let's see, two things I wanted to add. That one is that besides that, if you were into it, you got pretty good at figuring out which tubes were bad beforehand, because each device, each appliance had a tube map, a tube chart on the inside. And so, for instance, if your video was fine, if your picture was fine, just the audio went out, one of these three right here, and that's all you have to check out, because those are the audio tubes. And so it gave us troubleshooting skills, be able to divide an appliance down to the parts and what they did and how they interact. And you learn things like, picture's out completely, it's no high voltage. Well, it gets the high voltage from the horizontal sweep. Look there. And so you get to understand these things a lot better. The second thing I want to say was, let's see. And the 5-tube radio was also very popular.
Oh, the All-American 5.
All-American 5.
Yes.
And the same sort of thing. It had 5 tubes in it. It settled down to this design of 5 tubes, and each one has a little function. You know what they do.
Well, I only recently found out the reason for the All-American 5 was that it was cheap to make because it had no power transformer. The heaters added up to 110 volts. So you just basically it had fewer components. So almost every table radio in America, basically before transistors, was an All-American 5 for a while.
Huh.
Right, and they worked really well. They'd honed the design down to be so efficient and so nice, and it worked very well.
Yeah. Now there was a great overlap between motion pictures, television, and computers that took a while to congeal, to come together. But man, I was waiting for it. Probably like you guys, I was waiting for it for decades, because I knew that when that happened, I'd be in clover, because most film people did not understand the technology of TV. Most TV people knew nothing about computers, so they weren't prepared for digital. And so it was rather easy, to sit back among other people in the arts who frankly had a often rather sketchy idea of how the stuff worked.
Mm-hmm.
And were somewhat intimidated by it. They were also intimidated by the people who were the experts. So their attitude was one of often resentment, not gratitude. And I frankly delighted in tweaking that a little bit. People would say, well, let's see. If I had a really good TV in California, couldn't I get New York television? It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. Well, why doesn't it work like that? It's like, well, you try to explain it to them, and they didn't get it. Frustrating. I imagine most of those people are also retired by now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Most
Now,
of the
and then
who
some
don't know
people
anything about
just
those things don't.
some
know
people
anything
just delight in the
know not to
technology
know.
also. I'm thinking someone like director J.J. Abrams. The guy just loves the feel of acetate in his fingers.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for the way color looks on film, but I've never been a purist. You know, if the TV image, if the digital image is good, it's good. I will never say, well, if it's not 35, it can't be motion pictures. It's like, yeah, it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Just has to be good.
Right.
Yeah, that's my major criticism of a lot of shows. Like, people were upset about that new Star Trek show, Picard, and like, this is not Star Trek. I'm like, look, I don't care if it's not Star Trek, just make it good. And if you make crap, I mean, I'm going to call it out, and it is a terrible show. Anyways, maybe I'll get back to the segue back to the original questions, and then we can get into other things. How did you find
Only we
Ricochet?
had good segues.
Oh, yeah.
We learned nothing from the man.
Yeah. How did you find Ricochet?
Oh, it was easy. Rob Long was a member of the board of the American Cinema Foundation, which was my last job, which lasted, 20 years. And Rob was one of the nicest people on the board. He was one of the few big shots willing to take a chance on things. I mean, literally, it's like if you wanted to go to Sarajevo and you needed somebody to talk about television, he'd be willing to do it. You know, he'd be willing to show up and argue with anybody. He was fearless. I mean, he put his own career at risk. I think things were less censorious than they are now, God knows. I mean, but he was still sticking his neck out, which I always admired. And so when he started his own website, I thought, well, I'm going to join that just to help my old pal. And it turned out to be fascinating. It turned out to be great. And that's 10 years now.
Yeah.
Very nice.
And then, what do you most like about being on Ricochet?
Oh, let's see. Oh, that's a pretty comprehensive one. I like the variety of expertise. I like the fact that, I can get on there and be hopelessly, as I say, outclassed by Don and say, damn, I thought I knew this. Here's somebody who knows it 5 times better than I do. And it's not just music, but it could be anything. It could be medieval art. It could be the Catholic Church in Genoa in the 1800s, whatever it is. If there's a specialty, Ricochet will have a specialist that seems to emerge from the clouds and be able to tell you all about it. Like, well, Hank Rohde. I think you've read Hank's things about how to build a computer. And he's this kindly guy, kindly bearded guy. He looks like he's a refugee from ZZ Top. But man, when he gets into stuff, whether it's religion, whether it's, tunneling, electronic microscopes, he is flawless. He has the stuff down cold. And he's also a good writer, like many of you guys on Ricochet.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I do like the expertise, and it's be fun trying to find a topic where you can't find expertise. Just hunt that down.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that it's also humbling because my particular expertise, film and TV, a lot of people know something about it, but on Ricochet, you have a bunch of people who know a lot about it. And if you bring up an obscure TV show from 1966, somebody will not have been old enough to have seen it when it ran originally, but they'll have seen it on YouTube, or they saw the reruns when they were at Subic Bay in the Philippines with the Navy or something like this. And it reminds me that, our business, motion pictures, is really everybody's business. Everybody's got an opinion, and it's often a pretty educated one.
Yeah, that's true. You mentioned when I first approached you, you said you knew of a show starring a character named David March, who was a spy in Germany in World War II. I was like, what the hell is this show?
Oh, it's a good show, too. It only ran 17 episodes. It was on ABC, the Poverty Network. But it was Robert Goulet and a really cute girl. And it was an interesting premise. He was playing he was a double agent, basically. He was pretending to be a propagandist working for German radio. But in fact, that gave him cover to travel all over Germany, visit secret installations, meet with the top brass, and ferry all kinds of information back to America basically through pretty girls or clandestine radio or whatever the hell they used in 1944. But it was actually a rather nicely produced show also for the era.
Yeah, I've found a bit of it on Daily Motion. I'll have to go through it. I found a couple episodes on YouTube, but I was away at the beginning of the week, so I didn't have a chance to really get into it.
Right. Well, I saw the Skip Sewell interview that you guys did last week, and it was terrific. But now I've got to catch up with some of the others like Mongo. I want to see Boss Mongo.
Yep. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the great thing about this
was an
format
electronic nerd out.
You can go back and watch them anytime, and as we do more of them, people will will build up a library of members, which is one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to do the show. Is just we, like you said, we have all this expertise and all these interesting people, but unfortunately, it only seems to be the big people who get to be brought onto the big shows, and I get that they want to advertise things, but I think the most important thing here is the members and getting to talk to them. I know more about them. Everyone's got a story, and we have a way to share it now.
You do indeed,
and nobody else is doing it.
I guess Dave Carter has started doing some of them too. So, but he does it only on as a radio show kind of format via podcast, and we have the video ability here. So I also noticed you're into the photography group there. Can you tell us a bit about the group? I'm always like to hear more about the groups on Ricochet. So you're in the photography group. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who are quite enthusiastic photographers on Ricochet. One of them, again, was Skip Sewell, the guy you had last week. He is an electronics manufacturer, and yet he knows a hell of a lot about old pieces of glass that you stick on the front of a camera. And you can go on and on with him about, I got this Russian Zenit lens, and it's a 1.2. It's like, oh yeah, well, does it have a bayonet mount or a C mount? It's like, there are not too many people who can do that, and he can. So yeah, I like the fact that there's so much retro equipment being repurposed and put back into use. All kinds of stuff that could just be gathering dust somewhere, but somebody thinks, I think I'm going to try to make a movie in Super 8. And they do. Somehow they get the camera repaired, somehow they find a place to develop the film. And put a lot of old gear back into use.
Well, there was the movie Super 8.
Yes, 2011.
J.J. Abrams again. Obviously done from his childhood.
Right. It's set in 1979, and nearly every filmmaker who's a baby boomer started with 8mm film.
Yeah.
It's like they may not be eager to show you, but they've all got them. Everybody from Steven Spielberg on down made 8mm movies. And
that's right. And that was your most recent post.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. And same here. My dad had a regular 8 movie camera and projector. And the cool thing about it was that it had the single frame feature. So it was like Animation City. And so when I was like really young, and I'm talking like 10 years old or something, I did a movie where I invented some chemical that causes everyday objects to start moving by themselves. That's the plot. And so you pour this on this thing on a tape dispenser, and it goes off. And then during the course of this plot, it spilled all over and everything started moving at once. It was a lot of fun.
I did something
But yeah,
like
this
that.
stop frame animation is just a blast.
Now that's terrific. The Super 8 cameras rarely had single frame. They did later on.
Oh.
But the Super 8s were made to be snapshot cameras. They were meant to be as easy and foolproof as possible, so that even the most timid family photographer could just pick it up, push the button, and you get something.
Mm.
Whereas most 8mm cameras were a little complicated. You know, you had to set a focus, you had to set exposure on most of them, not all of them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, 8, because it had all those manual adjustments, let you do things like single frame. Later on, they had it for Super 8, but it was only on more expensive cameras because it was assumed that, you know, mom and pop did not need that feature to shoot Christmas movies.
Cool.
Actually, I still have that film
Ah, well, there we go. Coming next on
upstairs
time
somewhere.
on Land of Confusion,
Yeah,
John's movie project from when he was 10. Okay. I also noticed that you're a member of the Cars group. What's your favorite fast car?
Oh, wow, that's easy. Best car I ever owned. My favorite car was an Australian car, and Pontiac GTO, built there as a Monaro. Their General Motors brand in Australia is Holden. And the Monaro was a special cut down, you know, two-door muscle car from the 60s. You know, fairly similar to our GTO. And so when they developed a new Monaro after the beginning of this century, Pontiac imported them for a few years. And then basically the Obama administration put Pontiac in its grave because they would only loan to General Motors if they get rid of, you know, blatant appeals to shredding tires and using lots of gas.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, I remember having a little Sunfire as one of my first cars, and I drove it on. We had this highway that just opened up at the time, was a toll highway called the 407, and I learned what a governor was on my car driving down there at 11 o'clock after an afternoon shift.
Well, I also had a Chrysler Crossfire. I had a Jaguar XJ, and I had a bunch of cars. I like them.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have an electric, and I'm probably going to buy another electric or a hybrid.
Okay, what's your electric or hybrid?
I have a Nissan Leaf. My wife has a Chevrolet Volt. I like it so much that I think I'm going to get myself a Volt also.
Okay. Those things are little tiny cars. They don't have the kind of the performance that I would have thought some of those muscle cars would have.
Oh, no, you'd be surprised. The electrics have tremendous torque right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Unlike
gasoline engines where essentially you reach a power curve at, let's say, 3,900 RPM.
Mm-hmm.
Not with an electric. An electric's like a steam locomotive. As soon as you push it in, it goes. You know, the one
It's
thing
very
is
much like a steam locomotive.
Yeah.
yeah, you don't need a transmission on a steam locomotive.
Yeah.
You know, you've got all the torque you need right there.
Yeah.
Automobile engine in its native form doesn't have much push to it, but it has a lot of spin, and so you gear down that spin to get the push. The electric car, if anything, you do it the other way around. You've got so
torque
much
curves
push.
just it's the opposite pretty much. Yeah.
Right. And you know, price of gas this year is low, but it will go back up at some point.
Yep.
By the way, I'm not a fanatic on this stuff. I mean, a lot of electric car people are total geeks on it. I'm not.
Yeah.
You know, if you live up a mountain and you've got a trailer, don't get an electric. On the other hand, if you live in the middle of a fairly dense city and you know, the main thing you do is drive to the grocery every now and again because you're an old retired guy, why the hell would you need 3 tons of metal to do that? You know, you really don't. So.
No, my one experience with a hybrid / electric, my car ended up having to go into the shop for like a broken seatbelt, and they didn't tell me that they were getting me a rental and they were covering it. So I was kind of upset when the thing showed up, but then I found out no, it was covered by the warranty. But they gave me this Cadillac SUV hybrid, and It was dead quiet whenever I would stop in at the stoplight and would kick on the electric engine, and then it would go. But I drive right now a Chevy Cruze, and at the time I was paying like $40 a week for gas, doing a very big commute, and then for 2 days of using this thing, I had to return it with a full gas tank of like $60. I was not happy. I'm like, this is supposed to be an efficiency car, or what the hell?
The Chevy Volt is a so-called strong hybrid, which is a standard hybrid, let's say a Prius. A weak hybrid is basically, it's a gasoline car that has a certain amount of electrical assistance when you need it, a certain amount of push to get it going. Or at highway speeds, for example, the electric kicks in and helps the gasoline engine out. Strong hybrid's the other way around. A strong hybrid is an electric car which has a gasoline engine that runs a generator that charges the battery. So, for example, we bought my wife's Volt last May. We bought it with a full tank of gas. We still have a gallon left of that gas.
Oh, wow.
That's right. 13 months later, we have not been able to get rid of the damn gasoline because, you know, you plug it in at night and you always expect, well, and of course, if I run out of electricity, the gasoline will come in and save me. But it sure hasn't been needed for that very much. So all I can say is good for General Motors. They came up with something and then they screwed up the marketing of it because they never really spelled out that it was a hybrid. People were a bit frightened of it because they called it an extended range electric vehicle. It's like, well, what does that mean to most people? Nothing. Salesmen were not experienced with it. They didn't know how to explain it. They sold 200,000 of them. But next time they've got to do a better job of explaining what the hell the thing is.
Yeah, we see that all over the place where people don't do a very good job of explaining things, and then they don't wonder why they fail. You know, conservatism is a good example of something that doesn't get explained well to a lot of people. But but we keep making more of them. Every time I have almost all my friends are former liberals who became conservatives. They did one thing, and that made them conservatives. They started a business.
Oh.
And then they're like, what am I paying for? What's all this paperwork? I'm like, you voted for all of that. What was I thinking?
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on.
So, what else is there? So, and of course, you remember the Ricochet Film Society. What do you think of what's going on with Gone with the Wind?
Oh.
Well, it's selling like hotcakes, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is the number one film on Amazon Prime or Amazon right now. I see.
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I don't think there's any chance that, in fact, the movie will never be shown again, never be sold again, whatever. I think they're basically panicked because there is this, national rage against racism, whatever. So their attitude is, let's take this out of the light for about a year, is my guess, because it's too valuable to lose. Sheer money. They would be giving up tens of millions of dollars. They're not going to do that.
Yeah,
they'll do something.
HBO Max, apparently, I did find out last night, they got this woman who's a very famous critic from Turner Classic Movies, who's going to come on and do like an introductory video that you can skip, of course, to get to the movie, in which she just tries to explain historical context. And it's not like it's a SJW explanation going on. She's going to do the history of Black movies and how this is important to the show. This is the first African American and a woman to boot who wins the Academy Award, and so there's great cachet in this movie too. But
when I was a projectionist in New York, like about 40 years ago, I projected Song of the South, which was in revival then. And you'd think, New York City, oh my God, at the time, this is the time period the Joker is set in. And you'd think Black people must have rioted, they must have really hated this. No, they came to it. The little kids came to it. Grandmas brought the children. Part of it is that there was very little, how shall I put it? There was very little bluntly, that you could say about the South that people were proud of on film at that time. You know, there weren't too many things that were basically neutral, that were not, you know, explicitly about slavery or whatever. And Song of the South is not set during slavery. It's set roughly 50 years later. I believe it's set roughly around 1910.
Huh.
So it is controversial, and people have often brought it up in conservative sites as an example of something that's been censored, canceled, destroyed, hidden. It's none of those things. You can get it. I had it on Laserdisc here. You can still buy it. The reason Disney doesn't show it is because they're a little ashamed of some of it. And to tell you the truth, if you watch the whole thing, you can kind of see why. Disney's also in a unique position because they have theme parks. So it's easy for CBS to do something controversial, you know, because 15 minutes after it went off the air, it's gone. But with Disney, you've got families, you've got children. So it's like the last thing in the world they need is to be known as the network that kept Roseanne on the air and the network that releases Song of the South every 5 years. It's like they are afraid that, you know, 1/8 of American children are Black, and they want those people in the parks, and understandably so. So they're a little touchier than many other studios that might have just said, it's an old movie, to hell with it, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I think I remember. Well, first off, I remember as a kid, I got all these Disney books. It came as some sort of Disney package my parents bought me, and there's like 3 books, and they're all based on stuff that came out of Songs of the South. I kept asking people, where are the characters for these things? Why don't I ever see these characters? The Brer Rabbit and Tar Pit and all these stories that were there. Like, what is the movie that's attached to this? No one could tell me. And also there was just like, but I think they did do some repurposing of some of that stuff that would show up in the Disney Sunday Hour TV show that I grew up watching.
Yeah, they're still a little nervous about Zippity Doo Dah, but
yes.
a lot of the rest of it is okay with them. And I will cut Disney, as I say, a little bit more slack for cowardice than some of the other outfits who have really no excuse whatever. You know, they are in a somewhat more vulnerable position and are jumpier about it than most.
They're also, from what I can tell, a lot broke right now, so they're going to have some fun times ahead of them.
Oh yeah. Of course, they do have a few shekels in the bank, as we say. So I think they'll survive beyond the coronavirus. I think they'll survive beyond wokeness. I think they'll be around. I do think that, you know, and I've used this comparison on Ricochet before. I wish these media companies would look back to the year 1970, 1971 and see that it is indeed possible to destroy the trust that much of your audience has in you by getting aboard the bandwagon too quickly and too carelessly. I think they're going to get bid by having corporately thrown themselves so much under the bus on this one.
Well, we're already starting to see some of that. I don't know if you're very well aware of this, the stuff going on with Warner Brothers and AT&T.
Yeah, a little bit, but sure, you know, we can talk about that.
Okay, so from what I can tell, Warner Brothers did not want the Zack Snyder cut or whatever to ever see the light of day, and they're very pissed off about stuff that happened there. Then AT&T bought them and is telling them what to do now, and they're not used to having people tell them that, yes, we're here to make money. We like to make money. Why are you denying us the ability to make our money? Like, why are you allowing cash to sit on the table? We need content, and you're just going to throw it away because of your principles or because you don't like a guy? No. Bottom line, stock price. Like,
I remember in the 90s, there was an ad campaign in Variety that made fun of various people. I mean, the premise was that they were, you know, arrogant celebrities saying something that surely showed how clueless they were. And one of them was a studio executive, you know, full frame photo. and says, no .com schmuck is going to tell me how to run my studio. It's like,
Mhm.
oh yeah? Wait till they buy it, pal. You know,
Yep.
the owner will tell you what to do.
Mhm.
And yes, this is a case. AT&T is telling Warner's what to do, and they're not used to that.
Mhm.
You know, HBO was not started by Warner's. HBO was started by Time Magazine. It's hard to believe that not 50 years ago, 45 years ago,
Mhm.
that Time Magazine was a much, much bigger business than cable television.
Oh yeah.
Cable television was like a little hobby for them.
Mhm.
And HBO originals were absolutely crummy for decades. I mean, until the 90s, until things like From the Earth to the Moon, Sex and the City, Band of Brothers, cable originals were dreck. They were terrible.
No,
And
there's one I remember that I can occasionally watch. It was Mary Van Peebles, where he's like he's been injected by this werewolf drug to be and eventually kills the werewolf. And the other one is, of course, To Cast a Deadly Spell, which is a very schlocky movie based on H.P. Lovecraft meets like Hollywood detectives in the 30s. It's pretty crazy stuff.
yeah, for a long time, cable originals were things like on Showtime, you had That's Stupid with Gallagher. And HBO had, First and 10, I think, with O.J. Simpson. Uh, you know, classic stuff. I can't imagine why they don't rerun this more often.
Mhm. Well, they're going to be desperate for content, so I wouldn't be surprised when we see some really classic stuff come out of HBO Max, and people are going like, "What is this stuff?"
I just found a film that I thought had been lost, and of course, bang, it shows up on YouTube. You know, I'd been looking for it for years on
Mhm.
YouTube, and now finally somebody posted it. It's the most obscure Canadian film I've ever seen, and it's conservative. It's a conservative satire, a pretty biting and witty one called Paint Cans, 1994. Nev Campbell's first role. She looks very fetching.
Mhm.
And at the time, I reviewed it. I tried to get people to see it. You know, basically, I failed. I mean, we showed it in LA. We got it reviewed. We had an audience. They were polite. They didn't know what to make of it. The the premise is fearlessly, I wouldn't say self-destructive, but it's like calling down artillery fire on your own position. It's a
Mhm.
government subsidized film about the folly of government subsidized film. It's about a bureaucrat in Toronto who is basically in charge of getting money for obscure movies that understandably not a single person in Canada wants to see
Mhm.
or really cares about being made. But nonetheless, because they've got the right quota, the right language, the right, you know, whatever qualifications, they make the movie. And it's really deserves a post by itself because again, nobody's heard of it. I ask people all the time about it.
I'm looking at it now, and I'm like, this does seem familiar. So I'll have to definitely look into it now that I see it here. A Canadian government bureaucrat played by one Chaz Lawther is duped to backing of filmmakers Bruce Greenwood, who I definitely know, a project that no one likes.
Yeah, and the
It's like
LGBT
Mel Brooks,
community
the
is
producers, right?
Mm.
right.
It's called the CBC normal lineup. Like this is how Brian Maroney the musical got made.
Ah,
And you think you laugh, but it got made. Like, and this was major prime time on CBC show. A friend of mine, he's a movie. He wants to break into movie production, and so he goes down one day. He and a buddy of his are pitching a new show based on prison guards. or life in a prison. And my friend at the time had been a previous prison guard for 15 years, even got to be president of the prisoner guard union. And he said he and his guy went down to the CBC to do a pitch meeting for the show, and they thought they were going to get greenlit because apparently once you get the meeting, it's usually that's just a formality. And he says they go in there and there's like 12 people around this giant table, and there's one guy who's there just been hired from HBO, and the rest of them are just all lifers at the CBC. And they go in and they just start describing the show, and it's about how one guy's a newly arrived inmate, and the other guy is going to be a newly arrived prisoner guard, and they go through this growing period where you get two sides. And of course it was around the time of Oz, so that was a very good idea. And the HBO guy's like, yeah, we should screen this. What's going on here? And all the guys around the table like, you know what? We're not too sure if this fits our idea and that. And they don't get the meeting. And the two of them are walking out. And my friend turns to the other guy and he says, you know what just happened? That meeting that just happened, that happens every day of the week, Monday to Friday, and they just bring in people to do nothing but hard pitches on TV shows, and they greenlit none of them, and then they buy Jeopardy from the States and put that on at 7 o'clock at night, and that's the CBC.
Well, what a damn shame. We used to smuggle tapes, in effect. People who could get Canadian television used to send us VHS tapes. Mm-hmm. Because of frankly, the quality of some of the stuff, which you could not see down here at the time. We did not have, it was basically before satellite dishes and the relatively easy ability to see stuff north of the border. Mm-hmm. But it's also funny because from what I understand from our member Mistiocracy, who works in Ottawa, there have been a number of political shows, a number of political satire shows, the equivalent of, say, Parks and Recreation for Canada, or The Office for Canada. Something more like The Writing, something like that. Mm. And I said they're quite good, but we have not seen them down here, so I have to look them up on YouTube.
One I can think of that is, it was made by not by the CBC, but it was called Adderley. It is available on YouTube. It's 2 seasons, and it's a Canadian spy show. So this guy has his right hand is basically beaten up by a mallet, and he can't use it anymore. But he's still a senior. It's like, we can't let you go because you know too much. And he's always scheming to get back into active duty. But there's a lot of government bureaucracy in that one, and it is available on YouTube.
When I was 15, Expo 67 happened, and frankly, we were all rather jealous of Expo 67. It was gorgeous. Oh, it was fantastic. I mean, I did a post about the New York World's Fair of 1964, which I feel was kind of underappreciated. It's like, I know it wasn't 39, I know it wasn't 67, but it was pretty damn good for those of us of that age who were there. And all people, all the smart critics can do is say, well, yeah, but it wasn't as good as 39. It's like, well, okay, but you know what? I wasn't there in 39. This is all I had, and I thought it was wonderful. But 67 must have been a great time for, your older relatives, for people.
Yeah, it's a great time also for the mafia, the Canadian mafia, who made a killing off the government contracts, and I think of like 50% of all the money that went into paying for Expo 67, and that island and everything that went into it is just like lining a lot of bad people's pockets right now.
Oh, that kind of warms the cockles of my New Yorker's heart. Like what could be more normal than corruption and construction?
It's like 25% of all the money spent in Quebec in the last 50 years has gone into the hands of the mafia, and that's why all their bridges are falling apart.
There's a Canadian television show that my son and I have been watching about pro wrestling called The Dark Side of the Ring. And there's all sorts of stuff I had no idea about, because this is not the sort of thing they normally put in textbooks. And frankly, it was my first exposure to the idea that there was a mafia in Canada. I mean, honestly, with you guys, I would have thought, well, how would you even know what a crime was?
Well, because we brought in all the immigrants. All
There
these
you
Irish
go.
people taught us how to do crime. Irish and Italian immigrants, right? We poor
Oh.
WASP had no idea what we were getting into. No, actually, it's kind of funny. If you go back into the history of the founding of Canada, it's something called, we were founded by a group called the Family Compact. And there are these old WASP dudes who basically came up from either from America, and they just basically owned Ontario as a plantation. And some Scottish immigrants lords tried to come over here, and we're like, hey, we see you have a great racket here. How do we get in on this? We want to buy in. And they're like, get out of here, you Presbyterian. We own this place. We're not here to share. So, I mean, my city of Hamilton is built on a corrupt land deal by three of the founders of the city. They basically went and found the most cheapest property they could get, which was because the city of Hamilton is nothing but a swamp in the same way DC was. And so they put the local courthouse in the middle of, for most of this region, in the middle of a swamp so they could buy up all the land cheap.
Well,
Canadians are very good at being, we're very polite about things, but we're more than happy to get in. If there's money to be made and we can get it scammed out of the taxpayer or the government, we will find a way to do it.
I'm happy to hear that. It's like human nature is the same everywhere.
Oh, yeah. You were talking about some of the tax credit stuff earlier, or for movies, and like so many great Canadian movies made in the 1960s and 70s. My friend's dad apparently is one of the who made a killing off of Porky's.
Yep. I remember there was a huge fad for Adam Ogoyan movies, the experimental sort of filmmaker of, I guess, roughly 25 years ago was probably the height of his fame.
Mm-hmm.
Like Decline of the American Empire. I'm trying to think of some of his other titles. Anytime, and if you can combine pretentious talk about politics with a lot of female nudity, there's a place for that film in the independent market.
What is it? I can't remember who said it, but apparently one American director said something to the fact of like, I'm terrified to go to Canada because the only time I've seen it is in David Cronenberg movies.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people have that reaction to all sorts of regions, and my Southern friends on Ricochet get after me about New York. I remind them that at least we don't have banjo playing sodomites taking advantage of the tourists here. And I know this is a fact because I've seen it in the movies.
Yep.
Yep.
And my favorite one of those is not not Deliverance. It's Southern Comfort.
Oh yeah.
I saw that one a few years ago and I was like, what is going on in this movie?
There was a Canadian feature called Screwballs that I showed back in, I guess 1983. And it was 83, maybe a year or two earlier than that. It was basically a ripoff of Porky's in spirit. But one of the odd things about it is that, of course, it was filmed in Canada, but it pretended to be in the United States, which is, let's face it, not new for television programs or whatever. But at the time, they had to come up with all sorts of things that would reference things like President Taft and Adams, because they needed to take advantage of a technical academy that they were using as a location, because they loved the initials T and A up in the top of the building. So they came up with this contrived plot about President Taft and Adams's great-great-grandchildren attending the school, which, needless to say, the school's entire curricula appeared to be trying to spy on the girls' locker room. They seemed to study nothing else at this place. And actually, from the viewpoint of a young man, it seemed like pretty fascinating stuff.
Anyways, we have a lot of interesting little shows that happen in Canada over the years. So I'll be happy to maybe send you a few notes later on things. But yeah, you just remind me of Screwballs. I hadn't seen that in a long time. There's another one where it's Bill
we
Murray.
loved Second City. That was.
Oh yeah, SCTV is the gold standard around here.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
wrapping to the very original topic, there was one episode where they were their signal was jammed by the Soviet Union, and the Second City TV programming was replaced by Russian programming, and it was so damn fun. It was probably their funniest, because there's one section where they're showing off the new Soviet minicam, and the thing's the size of a Volkswagen coming.
Or how many countries can we fit into the Soviet Union? We can fit entire continent of Australia into the Soviet Union.
That was great. That was great.
Yeah. So, what is it? The Great White North. Remember that part of SCTV? The whole point of that show and why they had that big long screed at the end is because they were making fun of the Canadian content laws.
Oh.
So that's
I think they were just working with it.
Yeah, they're like, yes. So there is 3 Americans who work on our program, but they have all signed sworn affidavits that they drive snowmobiles and eat back bacon.
No, I understand that was the Great White North was constructed because they really had this need. So many percentage of their airtime had to be quote unquote Canadian content, and one of them said, well, "What do you want us to do? Drink beers and talk about fishing or whatever?" And sure enough, that's how it was born.
Was it?
So
yeah,
we can do
Canadian
that.
Content can be weird because we had radio stations as well you had to play a certain amount of music. There have been bands who've been made specifically to make money off the Canadian content loss.
Well, Paint Cans, that movie we were talking about a little while ago, is a satire entirely on that. You know, bureaucrats sitting around all day discussing, well, how much French was spoken? 3%. If we can get it up to 5, I can give you the money.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably true.
Yep, and it's certainly true. I have just bought a movie that I'm looking forward to watching yesterday. I found it in a used DVD store. It's the reconstructed Big Red one.
Oh, yeah.
The extra 40 minutes, and I'm going to watch that tonight.
Sam Fuller, yeah, good director.
Mm-hmm.
Great director. He has a lot of little-known stuff from the 50s, you know, things like Stakeout on Dope Street, you know, Tough Guy, 1953, you know, film noir. He was great at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think we're starting to run a little low on energy and a little low on time. It's been really great talking to you, and I'm going to ask you the same question we normally ask our guests at the end. Who would you like to see us talk to next?
Our version of Tag.
Yeah. No, I could see that. How about Judgmental?
Okay.
Give him a try. I would also suggest Mistiocracy, but, you know, he has a government job, and I think he's
we could do with what we did with Skip Soul for him.
Yeah, no, I mean, it would definitely have to be the witness protection program for Misty, I think. You know, he doesn't want any trouble, and I can't blame him, given the way people are going nuts on Twitter these days. Yeah, give the judge a try.
Yeah, I will. I think that's a great chance. I felt we got a little, with a couple of our guests there, we had guys who were 2 ex-Army colonels, which was great, but I want to get more of the breadth of Ricochet. That's why I was so happy when we got Skip Soul, because we got Don here got to really run off with it, and I was like trying to interject and like, no, we're going off on this end. And now we got to have you, so we have on the film critic side, and I really think that story about Rob Long's kind of an interesting one, because I don't think many people here had any clue about that stuff.
I don't think people on Ricochet have any clue of how courageous he is with non-conservatives. You know, it's like on Ricochet, it's like, oh, Rob's okay, but, you know, he's a little bit of a squish, you know, nice guy, maybe a tiny bit of a rhino, but then, you know, he has to go to all those cocktail parties. And it's like, he has stuck his neck out time and time again. And I give him credit that, because frankly, you know, it's a more expensive neck than mine. You know, like I did my little things too, but I wasn't, you know, if I was going to fall from my, you know, great height of my position, I'd fall about 3 feet, you know, and could get back up easily. He'd fall like 300 feet, you know, given where he is in the TV industry. So he deserves props for that. And, Ricochet, it's hard to be conservative enough for the crowd. So, yeah, I wish more people knew that about him.
Yeah.
I love seeing him on. I love seeing
hopefully-
on Greg Gutfeld's show.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, man, I used to sit up. The funny thing is out here, it wasn't on that late. It was on at midnight.
Mhm.
So it was relatively easy to keep up with it. And we used to joke that the only reason it was still on the air was that Rupert Murdoch did not stay up till 3 a.m. in New York.
Yeah, well, hopefully more people will watch our show and we'll learn more about Rob Long. So I'll get into that, and I'll be sure to put that in the plug on the show. So thanks for being with us here today, and we'll be seeing you on the post on Ricochet.
Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege and an honor. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye bye. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.